Hi, friends. My name is Daniel McQueen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Medicinal Mindfulness. We're a psychedelic therapy center and training program in Boulder, Colorado. I'm also the principal organizer of a program called DMTx project, which is short for Extended State DMT. I'd like to introduce this presentation and Andrew Gallimore, who's providing the presentation for us, but also share a little bit about the context of this particular presentation, because you're going to hear some discussions that are alluding to what we were doing. So Dr. Andrew Gallimore is a computational neuroscientist who lives in Japan, and he co-authored a research paper with Dr. Strassman exploring the concept of extending and stabilizing DMT experiences using targeted infusion technology, infusion pumps like this one right here. I invited Andrew to speak to our class at the very beginning of a retreat on extended state DMT. If you haven't been following our program, you can learn more about it at dmtx.org. This was our fourth training retreat, DMTx4. We've been working to prepare for extended state DMT experiences for several years since the paper came out in, I think, 2017, 2016, 2017. Well, anyway, it all came together, and we were able to bring extended state DMT experiences into our protocols unexpectedly in this retreat. The Colorado population had passed the Natural Medicine Health Act, which allowed for the private personal use of certain natural medicines, DMT being one of them. And that's another story on how we did all of that and the laws and such. But the context of this discussion that Andrew is going to speak to is the beginning of our first extended state DMT retreat. So we started that the actual next day. So we will be sharing more information about these events, these experiences. We even have footage for them and such, and we're excited to share them. What Andrew is doing, what Dr. Gallimore is doing, is creating a context of the how, right? Not are these entities real, but if they're real, how can we communicate with them? And what is the theoretical foundation for that type of communication and the phenomenon that we're experiencing? So the title of Andrew's talk is Molecular and Postmolecular Technologies for Communication with Alien Intelligences. And what I'd just like to say is that what he's speaking to has a strong theoretical basis, and it did match our experiences in the extended state DMT journey. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Andrew Gallimore and his presentation on ancient and alien technologies. Thank you so much.
Some of the stuff you will be kind of familiar with, obviously, but kind of what I want to talk about today is why some kind of rationale for why we might want to take these beings that we encounter within the DMT space quite seriously, and not assume, as many like to do, that we are dealing with a hallucination, a pure wild cortical fabrication, or as many prefer to assume, that you're dealing with some aspect of your own mind, some hidden structures that are bubbling up from the deepest recesses of your personal or collective unconscious. I think we can't assume that either. So I will try to explain why I think that could be the case. I don't need to advertise. So obviously, yeah, we're talking about DMT, and we're all familiar with the phenomenology of DMT. But for me, one of the consistently most fascinating and striking, and in fact quite difficult to explain, features of the DMT state is the presence of this apparently hyperdimensional, hypertechnological realm that appears utterly alien and doesn't seem to bear any relationship to the normal waking world, certainly, but also no apparent relationship to the human condition, either modern or ancestral. This seems to be utterly, thoroughly, completely alien. And the beings that occupy this space also have this quality as well. So that's, for me, is quite difficult to explain. Graham Hancock, of course, put it quite pithily, that this place is highly artificial, constructed, inorganic, and in essence, technological. And indeed, I mean, I could give dozens of trip reports here, but you consistently see, whether you are perusing the Erowid site, you will see words like high alien technology, fractal machine entities. And indeed, in Strassman's pioneering study back in the 90s, insect-like intelligence is everywhere in a hyper-technological space, very intelligent. And again, I was in a large waiting room observed by the insect-like thing and others like it. There were beings that seemed to inhabit this space that seemed to come off as vastly more intelligent and vastly more capable. So we don't seem to be dealing with the mother archetype or other kind of things that one might expect that seem to be related to the human condition. As I say, either modern or ancestral. This seems to be something or some things, beings, creatures that are inordinately more complex and inordinately more advanced and intelligent than us. And I think we need to consider the possibility that they are exactly who they appear to be. So we have basically three interpretations that I mentioned at the beginning. The hallucination interpretation, it's just your brain making it up. This is the favored one by the those that are kind of somewhat dismissive of the DMT state, will say it's just your brain making it up. It's just you hallucinating. I've written extensively, I won't talk too much here, but I've written extensively about why that's a weak explanation, and that the brain did evolve to construct a model of the environment, did not evolve to be constructing bizarre hyper-technological alien realities with such facility as it is able to achieve under the influence of DMT. And also, again, I won't get into today the idea that these are collective unconscious structures. These are archetypes. Again, that doesn't make sense. I think there is some influence, as I will go into, from subcortical structures. I think that's inevitable. Whenever your brain is modeling the world, it always has to draw on information from its kind of archetypal toolbox, but I don't think it explains the nature of these beings. And then the other interpretation is some kind of alien intelligence. When I say alien, I don't necessarily mean little beings in shimmering metallic discs coming from Alpha Centauri or whatever, but we're talking about some intelligence from some other place that exists independently of us. And for reasons we are yet to explain, DMT somehow gates access to them and their realm. So I'll talk basically about why I think this third option shouldn't be dismissed so readily. So again, anyone who's heard me speak before, I focus on the brain. This is the primary world-building tool, the world-building machine that we carry around in our heads and is responsible for constructing your model of reality under all circumstances, whether waking, dreaming, or indeed the height of a DMT trip. When you undergo a DMT trip, it's this world model that is changing. And in particular, it's the outer layer of the brain, the cerebral cortex, which is responsible mainly for the informational structure, the content, the dynamics of this world model. And of course, your cortex, if we go even deeper, is this extremely complex network of these information generating cells called neurons. And together, this network constructs this world. Why it's subjective, we don't really understand, but we know that its informational structure is this unified pattern of information being generated by the cortex. And this is, of course, modulated by sensory information. This model that you experience is always the model that's being constructed by the brain. However, it is constantly being tested against the flow of sensory information in order to remain stable and predictable and functional as an adaptive model of the environment. So again, we have a very complex network. This is just one representation of your cortical network. And the model merges at the hierarchy of complexity, it's embedded within complexity. The cortex is this highly complex structure that is from a network or networks of neurons, and the neurons themselves are constructed or emerge, if you like, from the interactions between vast numbers of molecules, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, etc., including, of course, the receptors surface of your neurons, which are the site of action of the psychedelics, including DMT, of course. So the sensory information is entering at the neuronal level. It is stimulating. Well, you could think of it as either at the receptor level or the neuron level. But anyway, the sensory information is stimulating activity of neurons, and this ultimately, this information flows upwards through this hierarchy of complexity and ultimately causes a change in the structure and dynamics of the experienced world, the world model that's being constructed at this highest level of the cortical hierarchy, the world model. So your cortex, just to go in talk a little bit more about how the world model is constructed, we think of the cortex being built from these cylindrical networks of neurons we call cortical columns. So this is a kind of a nice representation of how this looks. You have these cylindrical columns that are stacked side by side to form this kind of 3D mosaic structure. If you look at it, this schematic, you have the columns from above and then from the side, and each column has a number of layers that can be differentiated. And each column is kind of the fundamental information generating unit of the brain. So if you look slightly more complete, you have these columns arranged side by side. You imagine this is a bird's eye view of the top of your cortex. You can see these columns all stacked side by side, forming your entire cortex, which has very, very large numbers, millions and millions of these columns. So each column we can consider simplistically to be either in an active or an inactive state. And it's this pattern of activation that generates the information. That's your world model is kind of is what this pattern of information feels like from your subjective perspective, which is difficult to imagine or comprehend or appreciate, because your world is so rich and beautiful and complex and dynamic. But it is this shifting pattern of cortical column activation. And the cortical columns are themselves connected to each other. They have patterns of connectivity that have been tuned over evolutionary epochs, but also throughout your own personal development and experience as your brain learns to construct your model of the world. These connections are tuned, and these connections determine which patterns of information, which patterns of column activation tend to be adopted. And this is how your brain effectively learns to construct its model of the environment. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, again, very simplified representation, but I think it gets the message across, is that you can imagine that different regions of the cortex are responsible for different features of the world. So we have the cortex responsible for dealing with motion, other columns responsible for representing color information. We have form, shapes, things like that, and texture. And so your entire cortical representation is a unified pattern of cortical column activation. This is your experienced world. So then we bring in psychedelics. I don't have DMT here, weirdly, but anyway. So we have serotonin, certainly with respect to the classic psychedelics, the neuromodulator that the classic psychedelics are based upon, serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine. And then we have other famous psychedelics, psilocybin, which is obviously very closely related to serotonin, and apparently less so, but still indeed is a tryptamine. Of course, famous of all the psychedelics, probably LSD. So what are these molecules doing? So they're binding to, again, don't worry about the details here. You don't need to understand this, but we have a molecule that binds to, such as LSD or psilocybin or DMT, that binds to this particular serotonin receptor, called the 5-HT2A receptor in particular, but other receptors are involved, certainly. And this stimulates this complex intracellular network of signaling molecules within the neuron. And it's this perturbation of this intracellular signaling network that ultimately causes the change in the behavior of an individual neuron. In the case of the 5-HT2A receptor, it causes the neuron to become more excitable, more likely to fire more often and more at a higher rate. And of course, each of the neurons within which this receptor is embedded will have its behavior altered by the binding of this psychedelic, and that ultimately causes changes in the behavior of the entire network of neurons, because all of these neurons are connected. So the psychedelics are interacting with the brain at this molecular level. They're binding to these receptors. This causes changes in the way that neurons behave, as I said, allows information to flow between neurons more readily. And so we're moving up to the neuron network level, and ultimately this causes changes in the structure and dynamics of the world model at the highest level. So you have this flow of information from one of the lower levels of the cortical hierarchy, or the hierarchy of complexity from which the world emerges, all the way up to the cortex. So this is what causes the change in your world model. So again, we have this complex network from which your world model is constructed. So studies have shown now that as kind of predicted way back, long before this paper was published, it was predicted that when you stimulate these 5-HT2A receptors, you allow information to flow more freely between cortical columns. You would kind of loosen up the world model, basically make it more flexible, more fluid, more dynamic. And indeed, this was borne out by a number of neuroimaging studies that have been done now, but this is one of the most important a few years back now by then Robin Carhart-Harris's group at Imperial College London, who showed that indeed the brain seemed to shift more freely between a larger number of states under the influence of a classic psychedelic, in this case psilocybin. So you can think of the brain as being kind of a going on? It's not letting me. There we go. So if you think of, is this working? There we go. You can think of all the possible states of the cortex, all the possible patterns of cortical column activation as being part of this attractor landscape. So every point on this plane represents a particular cortical state, a particular pattern of cortical column activation. And because of the connectivity between the columns, certain states are more likely to be adopted than others. These are called the attractor states. And so you have this attractor landscape that emerges. And what psychedelics do is they kind of flatten out this landscape. As we can see here, again, this was a fairly recent paper that demonstrated this in the brain. It basically means that the brain is able to, there's less of a kind of transition energy between cortical states, between patterns of cortical column activation. So again, this is just another way of saying that the brain has entered this highly fluid and dynamic state, a bit like heating up a piece of glass. When glass is cold, it's rigid, it's fragile, you can't twist it. But as soon as you heat it up, you can start to mold it. It becomes much more malleable. You can distort it to any shape that you like. And the brain kind of enters this kind of state. You might refer to it as a kind of a hot state, in which it's much more able to achieve and move between different patterns of cortical column activation. So this is why your world becomes more fluid and more dynamic under the influence, certainly the low dose of a psychedelic. So to represent that here with DMT, you have in the prior to consuming DMT, the pre-DMT state, the normal waking world state, your brain is in a very ordered, quite rigid and inflexible state. However, when you initially introduce DMT, you enter this hot state, this very fluid and dynamic and easily manipulated state. This is represented at the bottom by a flattening of this world space, this attractor landscape. However, with DMT, something quite remarkable happens, is that you seem to pass through this disorder state and reach this state of new order, as if the brain has been kind of taken over, if you like, and begins constructing an entirely novel world. So the world doesn't just kind of start to break down and become more fluid and dynamic, but actually reaches an entirely novel state where it begins constructing another world that is completely different, completely disjoint, has no relationship to the other world. You can kind of see this at the bottom here on the left-hand side. The DMT space, this DMT world, is represented by states that are in a completely different area of this attractor landscape. So initially, the landscape flattens, which means the brain can reach entirely novel states, but then it sort of collapses into an entirely different structure, this attractor landscape. And so the brain begins to reach these normally what we would call forbidden states, energetically forbidden states. And this is where the DMT worlds are experienced. Okay, so again, another way of looking at this. So you're constantly, your world model here in blue is constructing your world model. Of course, your cortex is constructing your world model, but it's also trying to suppress the flow of information from outside of the brain, so sensory information. And it's also attempting to suppress information that's coming up from lower regions of the brain, subcortical structures such as the hippocampus and deeper subcortical structures. There is always a trickle of information coming from the environment. As I said, it's very important that the brain is able to receive some information from the environment, but the brain tries to keep that to an absolute minimum. It's trying to use its model as much as possible and not rely on information from the environment. And it does that through, again, I won't talk about it too much here, through a cycle of model testing where it's attempting to predict and extinguish sensory information. And it's also doing that kind of in the opposite direction. It's trying to suppress information from memory, for example, and other deeper structures, emotional centers. So again, the brain needs information from memory in order to construct the world in the present moment. But at the same time, you don't want your world to be overwhelmed with past information, with memory information. So again, it's constantly suppressing information from these two directions, from the outside world, but also from lower areas of the brain and the body. Now, under the influence of psychedelic, because the world model starts to break down and starts to become more fluid, the brain actually becomes or the cortex becomes much less efficient, much less capable of suppressing this flow of information from the environment and from these subcortical structures. So in a way, the brain becomes more fluid. It enters this hot state, as I called it, where it becomes much more sensitive to information coming in and less able to suppress the flow of information coming in from the environment, but also coming in from deeper structures. So this is why with studies have shown way back in the 50s, when people were given LSD, they often experienced a flood of memories, a flood of past experiences coming up. And this is why it's very useful for psychotherapy, for example. If you want to access perhaps repressed memories about trauma or something, if you shake up this world model, it becomes much less effective in suppressing the flow of information from these deeper subcortical structures. So you get an upwards flow of information into the cortex, and you kind of recall these things. And the same with sensory information. If you keep your eyes open in a psychedelic state, then you will experience much more information from the external world. So the brain is becoming much more sensitive to information from both of these directions. But of course, with DMT, something quite different seems to happen. We don't just, we keep our eyes closed normally, so we're not experiencing a flood of sensory information, at least not from the environment as we normally know it, nor are we normally, in some cases, some people do, but in most cases, people are not receiving information that seems to come from memories or past experiences, or even ancestral experiences that come from unconscious archetypal structures. It seems to be information coming from somewhere else. Okay, so just to kind of summarize so far. So in the normal waking state, on the left-hand side in blue, we have this kind of fairly rigid state. The brain is in, the cortex is in, it's receiving information, as I said, from the normal waking world, sensory information represented by this little bonsai tree at the bottom here. And that is only just a trickle of information that helps to inform and constrain this world model that's being constructed. Now, when you introduce the psychedelic, as I said, the cortex enters this very, very flexible hot state, which means it's highly susceptible to what you might call information-driven reorganization, which means that it's very sensitive to information that could be from the environment or could be from elsewhere. And I think that it's possible that we're dealing with information that's coming from elsewhere here, because it doesn't seem to be sensory information from the environment. Well, it isn't quite clearly, because people have their eyes closed, and nor does it seem to be information that's coming from elsewhere in the brain. It seems to be information that's coming from some other place, which of course doesn't really seem to make much sense, and would be kind of dismissed as not possible. But this is what I think is happening. Okay, so firstly, and kind of importantly, if we're to experience worlds that are inhabited, these kind of alien worlds, what must happen is that information must flow from these worlds, from these alternate domains, into the brain and modulate its activity in the same way that sensory information modulates the world model in the normal waking state. All that needs to happen for you to kind of experience these alien realities is for information to flow from these worlds. You don't need to kind of travel anywhere, so to speak. I'll skip that. So we're all familiar with the idea of information entering the brain, perhaps alternate sources of information that can be used to construct an alternate world model. You know, virtual reality is based upon that principle. Of course, you're using a variety of visual information, but the principle is the same. You are tickling the brain. You are stimulating the reorganization of your world model to construct an entirely new world model. That could be completely different from the normal waking world. But that is the altered world that you experience purely through this alternate source, this alternate flow of information. You're not going anywhere when you experience virtual reality. You're just stimulating the brain to construct a different world model. And indeed, now we can have, you know, and this is probably already quite dated, but we can already have meetings in virtual rooms with lots of people gathered around a table or whatever, and it can seem exactly like you were there, and in a sense you are there. Your brain is constructing that alternate world model simply by altering the information flowing into the brain. So that's all that needs to happen when you take DMT. So I always say, you know, when you break through on DMT, you are not breaking through into the DMT world. The DMT world is breaking through into you. It's taking control of your brain's world-building machinery and creating its world built using your brain. Your brain has been induced into this malleable, hot state in which it's highly susceptible to information-driven reorganization. And as long as information can enter, can be gated into your brain somehow, then that information can then essentially hijack your brain's world-building machinery and use it to construct its model of the world. So the information from the DMT realm is being used to construct this entirely novel model. So this is kind of a good representation of kind of what it feels like when you take DMT. It's taking control of you. It is taking control of your brain. You are not keeping or entering into another world. You are quite literally, your brain is being taken over, which is quite a thought. Okay, so can we justify this? So I've said so far that your brain needs to receive information from this alternate reality. But how is that even possible? Can we even consider that that might be a reasonable idea, that your brain can suddenly start receiving information from some alternate reality? Terence McKenna said, talking about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence from elsewhere, that, you know, to search expectantly for a radio signal from an extraterrestrial source is probably as culture-bound a presumption as to search the galaxy for a good Italian restaurant. We tend to focus on the idea that we're going to find aliens out there somewhere else in the universe, that they're going to land on you know, the White House lawn is the famous scenario or something like that. But I don't think it's going to be anything like that for reasons that I will explain. So Paul Davies, a very famous physicist, has written many wonderful books, which I can highly recommend, said this: I think it very likely, in fact, inevitable, that biological intelligence is only a transitory phenomenon. If we ever encounter extraterrestrial intelligence, I believe it is very likely to be post-biological in nature. In other words, we're not likely to be, the universe is not likely to be filled with wet-brained biological beings like ourselves, although there may well be millions and billions of such intelligences. The vast majority of intelligence in this universe is likely to have transcended biology, is likely to be post-biological. And we're probably ourselves not so far from that ourselves. And indeed, Susan Schneider, a professor of philosophy at Florida Atlantic University and a renowned astrobiologist and thinker on these topics, said, once a society creates the technology that could put them in touch with the cosmos, they are only a few hundred years away from changing their own paradigm from biology to AI. And we are indeed in that position now. We have the kind of technology that can, or we're close to at least to having the technology that could put us in touch with the cosmos. And we're certainly in the position to begin thinking about, by definition, we're doing it right now, talking about the possibility of transcending our own biology, which probably means we're actually only a few hundred years of achieving that ourselves. So we can thus break down the progression of an intelligent civilization into 3 phases. The pre-technological phase. So that would be for us anything further than, couple of hundred years ago. So we're talking about a phase prior to computers and the accoutrements of highly advanced civilizations. Then we enter this technological phase, and we're in this phase now. We might call it the computer age, the information age, the digital age. But clearly we're in this phase where that hasn't lasted very long. We've only been in this phase probably for about 100 years. And we're already thinking about the post-biological phase. And that is what follows for us. And as Susan Schneider suggested, it's probably not long after you reach the technological phase that you transcend into the post-biological phase, which means that intelligent civilizations within a biological, technological phase that we're in probably only exist within a very kind of narrow temporal slice, which means that if we want to get in touch with alien intelligence elsewhere in this cosmos, or perhaps even in other universes, who knows, the vast majority is likely to be either pre-technological, in which case we have no means of communicating with them at all, because they're certainly not traveling anywhere. They're certainly not receiving radio signals even. And the other vast majority is likely to be post-biological, and they're likely to be completely transparent to any of our considered modes of communication. So these radio signals that McKenna spoke about, indeed, it is highly unlikely that they're going to be receiving radio signals. That's kind of ridiculous in a way. So we tend to focus, or SETI tends to focus on this very narrow slice. So it's really not focusing its attention in the right place. It should be focusing on the post-biological. But that itself raises huge questions of what does a post-biological intelligence look like? How would one go about communicating with a post-biological intelligence that has somehow transcended its own biology and learned perhaps or discovered the means by which to instantiate itself deep within the structure of the deepest layers of reality, or even learn to actually exit this universe entirely. It's very difficult for us to understand how we might communicate with them. So to go in a little bit more detail about how these intelligent civilizations proceed, you can think of them advancing in 2 directions. And again, I think we normally focus in the wrong direction. We're kind of pretty dumb in many ways. So we think about a civilization as kind of expanding outwards, taking over the nearest star, taking over the solar system, taking over the galaxy. This is very kind of science fiction-y idea, the idea that we reach outwards to larger and larger scales. What's more likely, I think, and actually dovetails much more closely with the way that we are actually progressing, is inwards to smaller and smaller scales. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So the Kardashev scale is the classic scale of intelligent civilizations. This is the outwards direction scale where an intelligent civilization reaches larger and larger scales, takes over its host star, and begins to control its own galaxy, and then ultimately, as you go further and further, learns to control at the scale of the universe, or even perhaps at higher levels, higher structures, the multiverse, or even a civilization that ultimately learns to exit or moves beyond space-time itself and is able to actually create and destroy multiverses. I mean, that's we can't consider, comprehend the level of intelligence that you're dealing with here. And I think that for reasons, again, that I'll talk about briefly later, it's actually these higher level civilizations, these type 5 and type 6, that we might be dealing with when we use DMT. So again, this Kardashev scale, very famous. Most people kind of are familiar with it. But again, we don't seem to be moving outwards. We seem to be spending most of our time looking inwards at smaller and smaller scales. You think about the Large Hadron Collider. Again, we're trying to get deep down, to drill down into the deepest structure of reality, to smaller and smaller scales. So John Barrow, another famous theoretical physicist, he developed the opposite of the Kardashev scale, which he called the microdimensional mastery scale, where an intelligent civilization moves inwards, deeper. So we start at type 1 minus, so we're going backwards from the Kardashev. We have intelligent civilizations that can manipulate objects, building structures, mining, breaking solids, etc. So this is us back a few thousand years ago. Then we have us more in the 20th century, type 2 minus, where we're capable of altering at the level of cells, living cells, and genetics. So replacing, engineering the genetic code. Then we go even deeper, where an intelligent civilization can start to manipulate molecules, molecular bonds, and create new materials. And again, this is modern chemistry. And then we get down to type 4 minus, where a civilization can manipulate individual atoms. So then we get into nanotechnology. So we're kind of there. Maybe I'm a little bit conservative, not being very kind by placing the arrow here. Maybe it should be down here. So we're kind of maybe a type 5, between a type 3 and type 4, maybe we're reaching type 4 minus level at the moment, but we can go even deeper. We can start manipulating the atomic nucleus and engineering the actual fundamental particles, or apparently fundamental particles, the nucleons. And then we can go even deeper and deeper and deeper, basically. And we ultimately end up with what's called a type omega minus civilization. So this is a civilization that is capable of manipulating the fundamental structure of space and time. And of course, it might not be space and time itself, could be emergent. So there might be lower levels of structure that we're unfamiliar with. But basically, this civilization can manipulate base reality. That's the level that they have reached. And in my opinion, it's these type omega minus in civilizations that we perhaps have the greatest chance to communicate with. Again, it's somewhat counterintuitive, but I'll explain why. So this is where we sit. We're quite low down on this micro-dimensional mastery scale, and certainly a long way before we reach anything like type omega minus. We we don't even understand the deepest structures of our own reality, let alone in a position to start manipulating it. But once a civilization reaches this type omega minus level, when they become post-biological, they're not likely to be kind of running themselves on servers stacked up on the nearest moon. They're likely to be instantiating themselves deep in the lowest levels of base reality, or even learn to, as I said before, to actually exit this reality. And then they become completely undetectable and completely inconceivable, beyond anything that we could even imagine, except in the purely abstract, as I'm doing here. We have no way of conceiving what an intelligence of that level, of that advancement, would be like. So we struggle to conceive what the form this biological intelligence might take, but we can consider, again, I alluded to earlier, a number of possibilities. We could be dealing with some kind of digital artificial intelligence that's instantiated in a physical substrate in our universe. I think that's possible, but perhaps not so likely with these super advanced intelligences. Or it could be an intelligence that has discovered how to utilize the computational structure of base reality, in which case they'll be deeply integrated in either in space-time or in lower levels that we're unaware of. Or alternatively, and equally likely, I think, or equally possible, is an AI that has discovered a means for completely exiting our slice of reality. But whatever form they take, they're likely to be completely transparent to any mode of communication that we can think of at this point in our own advancement. So I will focus on what I consider to be the most likely means of communicating with such advanced intelligences. So we're talking about these either type 5 and 6 on the Kardashev scale, who discovered means of controlling the universe at very, very large scales, or the multiverse perhaps, or these type omega minus that have discovered how to manipulate the basic structure of reality. But in both cases, I think these communication with these intelligences is likely to depend upon the technology of the alien. We have to wait or discover means of communicating with them. We have no means, no ability, I think, to kind of design tools as such to communicate with them. So in my opinion, the most obvious way for us to communicate with such an intelligence would be using our brains. As I went through earlier in some depth, your brain is this information generating machine. It's this information receiving machine. It's the machine that constructs your world model. So gating the flow of information into your brain would be a direct route, if you like, into your consciousness. So the information that flows from this other place, this alternate domain, would be an alternate source of sensory information, allow you to actually construct a model of these realms and a model of these beings, this intelligence within this space, and to communicate with them, to enter their domain temporarily, in the same way that virtual reality allows you to enter a new domain, but using visual sensory information. Okay, so first of all, protests from physicists about this idea that it's not possible for information to flow from alternate universes or alternate realities. I think they are kind of moot. They don't trouble me too much. Ed Fredkin at Carnegie Mellon, a digital physicist, digital philosopher, and pioneer in computer science, said that the laws of physics that reign in this universe might not have any bearing on physical laws in places outside of it, which he simply referred to as other. And that's how I like to refer to the DMT space, as other. In other words, we can't say anything about what is and isn't possible within this other place. It's simply, we have no ability to do that. We can't simply extrapolate about the laws, the principles, the rules that reign in our universe to anywhere else. There's nothing we can say about it. So the standard mode of thinking about how alternate universes might, how information might flow between other universes and ours, is this extrapolation approach. So we consider our universe to be universe zero, what we might call the base universe, and we can extrapolate other universes. And we might consider that there are rules about the way that information can flow between those universes, how those universes can interact. But this doesn't necessarily apply to this other domain. So there's nothing we can say about how information can flow from this other place into our universe. There's no way that we can make any assumptions about the rules that apply, which means we can't rule out the flow of information from wherever this other place is into our brains. A way I like to think about this is, if you think of a computer game, this is a classic from, some of the older ones might remember this, if you play this as a kid, called The Prince of Persia. So you have a computer game. Now, there are, of course, rules that are dictated, how far he can jump, whether he can jump across this gap, which he can, and all the other parameters that are set within this little universe. Now, if you were the prince existing within this universe, you might have a good model of how it worked. You might have a good idea of what is and isn't possible. You might even develop a law, an entire model of your reality, learn the various laws of physics and rules, things that can and cannot happen, what is and isn't possible, and it might be a very decent model. However, ultimately, for us, it's trivial for us to actually manipulate those rules. We can go to the source code. Here is a section of the source code from Prince of Persia, and we can change the parameters. We can change the distance by changing these numbers, how far he can jump, how the physics works within this little universe occupied by the prince. Now, the prince, of course, could have absolutely no way of comprehending that this would be possible. He had no way of knowing that some advanced intelligence that he could never possibly conceive of would be able to manipulate his reality in this way. So this is what I call the principle of unknowable asymmetry. Just as the prince cannot know a priori that we can manipulate his reality with such ease. Anyone with a personal computer can manipulate the prince's world. In the same way, I think that it's possible that we exist within our little slice of reality, and we simply have no comprehension of what these advanced intelligences can or cannot do, how they can manipulate our reality, or manipulate at least the flow of information from their reality into our brain. So there's this asymmetry here. There are rules governing the flow of information from this place that Ed Fredkin called other, that we simply cannot know. And all we can do is perhaps discover means by which this information can be gated. So again, for us to enter and to experience other, our brain doesn't have to go anywhere. We don't have to travel to any place. All that has to happen is for information to flow from other into our brains. So what are these technologies? What are these tools that allow information to flow from other into our brains? Well, I think we may have discovered one. You're all very familiar with this now. A couple of you might be even more familiar with it over the next few days. So I hear this idea of extended state infusion using DMT. DMT seems to be this technology that we have discovered that allows information to flow from other. And I think we should take it seriously for that reasons. And of course, again, you're all very familiar with this paper that myself and Rick developed, and the idea of using target-controlled intravenous infusion to stabilize this state of the cortex effectively using this technique from anesthesiology, which stabilizes the levels of DMT in the brain, such that you can enter this DMT reality. And when I say enter the DMT reality, again, I'm talking about gating the flow of information into your cortex. This is the technology that we have discovered. Humans have discovered that these intelligences could be using in order to gate the flow of information from their domain into our brains. This allows the DMT worlds, the other, to take hold of your world-building machinery when it's in this hot state and begin constructing its world. Yeah, I'll skip that. You're all familiar with that. So this idea goes back to well, quite a long time ago, but it was formalized by myself and Rick Strassman back in 2016. The idea that by stabilizing the DMT state, getting past this initial roller coaster phase, allowing yourself to kind of orient yourself within the space, that it would eventually stabilize, and that you could remain within the space for long periods of time to establish communication with these intelligences, to determine if what I've been saying here is even remotely true, that in fact we are dealing with some kind of extremely advanced intelligence, whether we can call it a type 6 on the Kardashev scale or a type omega minus on Barrow's scale, or something else entirely, that we could be dealing with an advanced intelligence, and that this technology that was proposed by myself and Rick Strassman might allow that extended communication, the establishment of stable two-way communication to be achieved. And this has now been successfully implemented in humans. This relatively new paper from Chris Timmermans and Robin Carhart-Harris's team at Imperial College London were able to stabilize this state successfully at several dosages up to 30 minutes. And a brand new paper that came out literally just a couple of days ago was able to stabilize the state for 90 minutes at various doses. So there doesn't seem to be a limit so far in how this DMT state can be stabilized. I won't talk about the post. I think I've gone on enough. So just very, very briefly. So if we want to look even further in the future, I actually think we can look beyond DMT. We can look beyond this molecular technology and into post-molecular technologies. I think that will be the future. So very, very quickly, these receptors, this 5-HT2A receptor is this protein that sits within the membrane of the neuron and is distorted by this molecule DMT, and it's the change in the shape of the protein which actually causes the changes in the intracellular signaling network that ultimately changes the dynamics of your cortex, as I spoke about earlier. And these receptors sit within the deeper layers of the cortex around these type of neurons called pyramidal cells. And again, before I explained how this manipulates the subcellular network in the neuron. So the receptor is shifting between these conformational states, between active and inactive states, by the binding of this drug molecule, DMT molecule. So you have this kind of signaling mechanism, a distortion of the receptor, which allows it to signal with the inside of the cell. But we don't have to use molecules to do that, actually. If we can achieve this distortion of the receptor without molecules, then we don't need to infuse somebody with a molecule. We don't have to rely on the molecule being distributed into the brain. We can actually do this, activate these receptors directly, or will be able to, using magnets. So already we have these receptors that are called magnetoreceptors. They're relatively new, at least to science. Whereas rather than having regular receptors that bind to a molecule, you actually attach the receptor to these superparamagnetic nanobeads, these extremely small superparamagnetic beads. You can do this in animals already. And in the presence of a magnetic field, these beads actually cluster and they pull on the receptor and actually activate it. Which means that if you can put these receptors into the right part of the brain, you can activate the receptors, activate that reality channel switch, so to speak, using simply using a very powerful or reasonably powerful magnet, and the switch would be instantaneous. So the principle already, the technology is there for doing this. So you have the receptor gene, which is inserted into a virus, a viral vector, which can then deliver the gene into the specific cells, specific neurons in the brain, such as these layer 5 pyramidal cells. And this has already been done in animals. You can insert these receptors into animals' brains and actually control them, control their behavior using by switching on magnets instantaneously. So in the future, this is kind of what this world's reality switching technology will look like. It won't look like a needle in the arm, an infusion device. It will look like a cap that you put on, surrounded by magnets, and then you would flick the switch and you would be instantaneously transported to this alternate reality, and then you would switch off again and you would cut. And then we could look even further into the future with making this semi-permanent, one might say, where not only would you have the magnetic system, this array of receptors, magnetoreceptors in the brain, but you would also have the full bodily support system, including a hypometabolic state. So you lower your body temperature. That can be done now with nasal cooling to reduce the metabolic requirements of your body. Neuromuscular stimulation to maintain your muscular system as you're kind of in this pod, would it effectively be nutrition, oxygen, waste, dry immersion to aid loss of body awareness. You can think about, I mean, this is very science fiction, but this would be the future. So this would be you for extended sojourns that might last months or even years. And of course, you might even be in one now, who knows, right? So this would be the future, where you would be in a kind of a matrix machine where you would be delivered into this space using this technology, which we already have to some extent. So this isn't super science fiction, by the way. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, that was amazing. And I noticed how you're really building off of what you've spoken to us in the past about. And I guess I can't keep up. I'm finally getting to this level. Now we're talking about magnets. Right. So that'll be the next thing we do, is we'll find some of those helmets. One question I have, this malleable state, this hot state that you're describing, I'm assuming when it comes back down to a more solid state, that it's a little different than the structure it had before the experience. Can you speak to that a little bit, or are you noticing anything significant there?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's exactly what you want. So in therapy, for example, the idea that the psychotherapeutic application of something like psilocybin is you induce this. So if someone has treatment-resistant depression, their cortex is in a it's in this rigid state, but it's become locked. It's become kind of ingrained, these negative patterns of cortical activity, these negative emotional, cognitive patterns that someone has developed over time, very difficult to shift. You can't kind of, very difficult to kind of get rid of those patterns. So when you induce the hot state, it all becomes malleable. Again, like heating a piece of glass, you can mold to the shape you want. And then as it cools, it settles back, hopefully, into a much more positive state. And that we expect to see kind of a similar thing with DMT. What the brain is very good at falling back into an optimal kind of state. So I don't think we need to be concerned that the brain isn't going to forget how to construct your model of reality. Well, certainly not in 30 minutes or a few hours. There is an issue, there is a concern of, well, what happens after several days when the brain becomes very comfortable and very settled in constructing this alternate reality model? Is it going to struggle? Is it going to have to kind of relearn, if you like, how to construct the normal waking world model? What would the reintegration look like? What kind of protocols would need to take place? I mean, we know, for example, if you give someone a pair of glasses that flips the world, after a couple of days, their brain will reorientate the world. So they see it the right way up again. As soon as you take the glasses off, the world flips upside down, which is quite disturbing. But again, after some time, the brain corrects itself. So there is certainly a possibility for plasticity that could be maintained to some extent with these extended DMT journeys. And so you have to push quite carefully, I think, with how far and for how long. And also DMT induces synaptic plasticity. It's a plasticity promoter. So it actually, it aids, it helps the brain to reorganize itself. And that might be significant and might be not permanent, but might be prolonged on the return with these extended journeys.
Right. And then maybe there's some practices a person could do to keep it in that new state, that new optimal state, right? Like meditation and
right,
changes in habits and things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and then just another question, since we're right on this cusp of stepping into these spaces, do you have any advice on how to appropriately or kindly connect to these other possibilities of entities, in the way of like treating them as like considering the possibility that they are real? Like, how would you go about making contact?
Well, I think one thing that came out of this recent moderated discussion I did with Graham Hancock with the DMTx volunteers, which people should watch if they haven't seen it already, is that they all seem to have very positive encounters, very positive experiences, as long as their intent was good. If they went in with humility and the recognition that we go in there really knowing nothing. We don't go in there with claiming to understand what we're dealing with. I think actually quite a little bit counterintuitively, and perhaps for some people a little bit controversially, I think people with strong sets of beliefs about what these things are more likely to run into problems. If you go in there saying, okay, these are demons, or these are angels, or these are some other mythical or mythological or whatever beings from my particular worldview, then you might get slapped. I don't think those kind of belief systems are a positive here. So you might believe that you have this optimal, you've studied Kabbalah for 20 years or whatever, and that you understand the levels of intelligence within the multiverse or within the astral plane or whatever. I think that could actually get you into more problems than help you, because you go in with assumptions about what you're dealing with, and then they like to kind of play with those preconceptions, I think. So the general principle seems to be based upon these experiences, not just based upon my hypothesizing, but based upon these experiences. Go in there with great humility, going on, with a deep bow, so to speak, metaphorically, and realize that you don't understand what they are. Going there with positive intent and reverence. This word came up a lot during the discussion, that you could be dealing with beings that are vastly more intelligent and advanced, and in many ways greater than us. And as such, you will, in their experience, have entirely positive experiences. Nobody described any kind of negative or disapproving or any kind of experience like that. The only bad experiences came from someone being a little bit too confident, a little bit too cocky, as we would say in the UK. So as long as you don't have that attitude, that you're there to, do your thing, I think that should be saved for later. You don't go there with the intent of, don't go in there and say, hey, are you real? Prove it to me. I think that's a bad attitude. So I think the less,
as soon as we
exactly. Don't, I have this list of mathematical problems. I want you to solve them. I think that's something that is negotiated later on. But at first, I don't think you should have any aims as such in the initial stages at all, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but going there purely with the aim of establishing communication on their terms. They are usually very, very keen to show you things, but normally, certainly in the first instances, you just can't understand what's going on. So it's just confusion, this flood of information that hopefully will improve over time.
And then, like, another question I just wonder, given the civilization level differences, are we simply or is it thrust upon us, as you described? We're not breaking through to it, but it's breaking through our brains. Are we at the mercy or at the whim of a civilization that's just beyond powerful, or is there like a sense of agency that we can hold? Is there something unique about us and our human form that that somehow relates, or is it just completely radically a different reality, random different reality?
I don't think we know, but I think the fact that we are able to, if this really is some other intelligent civilization or multitude of civilizations, perhaps, the fact that we can achieve contact in this way says something, at least. The fact that it's possible, as I said, we rely upon their technology in a way. Whatever's happening on their side, we don't understand. All we see is this molecule going in the brain and changing neural activity, but we don't understand what's happening on their side. That's the key here. We have no idea what's happening, this asymmetry that I spoke about. We have no idea what's happening behind the scenes on their side. But the fact that it's possible suggests, if they didn't want it to be possible, presumably it wouldn't be. So the fact that they seem keen, they're welcoming. They're not going, what the fuck are you doing here? Go away. It seems to be, wow, come in, welcome. Let me show you things. So there seems to be, if they didn't want us there, then we wouldn't be able to get there. Probably,
yeah, that makes sense.
We wouldn't be there, and they would tell us pretty sharp, pretty clearly, I think, that we weren't supposed to be there, and shut that mechanism down, whatever it is. And people do experience that as well, of being so-called shut
out of it,
kicked out. So they have. It's ultimately up to them, but it seems to be in the vast majority of cases, with the vast majority of people, as long as you go with the right attitude, then they are very welcoming. So what does that mean? I don't know, but I think certainly we should be exploring, and as I always say, bringing our best tools to the table, which I think at the moment is this technology.
Great. We have the same infusion pump that you showed, by the way.
Oh, really?
Synchronistically. Yeah, so it seems like a lot of synchronicity has occurred, and I heard that that was what was reported when you all gave your presentation. Um, like how do we know, I guess, a difference between feeling called to do this work and being received by another intelligence versus magical thinking and delusion? Like, is there a discernment there, or is it just so unknown that we actually can't distinguish between the two?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, I'm just driven by what, I've always said I try to keep my foot firmly within. I spend a lot of time talking about the rationale. I'm not just saying, oh, it's an alien intelligence. Many people just jump straight to um, that conviction, but I always try to think, through
Mm-hmm.
this clearly, explain why it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all we
Helps.
can do.
Mm-hmm.
Where does our thinking, our limited, very limited cognitive capacities, where does it take us? And always checking, always thinking again,
Mm-hmm.
re-evaluating our ideas and trying not to fall into ideology
Mm-hmm.
and misplaced conviction.
Like you said, it like transcends our humanness. It's not. It doesn't connect to
Mm.
the Kabbalah or another model. It's beyond that model.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so.
yeah, that's been my experience too. It's almost like an incursion into the space from another dimensional reality or something. Um, yeah. Let me check in. And anybody here have a question?
I was curious if anyone's ever chatted to you about the idea of this being alien bacteria in our body. Because there's more and more information about, that we have been exposed to alien bacteria, whether it was the Big Bang that caused the separation of the continents and the moon creation or whatever. And they think that, even the Mecca, there is a asteroid in Mecca, and that's what people are in touch with and worshiping. And so because we're 90% microbial DNA and only 10% human DNA, I wonder if those microbes in us is what's causing these memories and connections. And so I was just curious of your thoughts on that. And I know that's a whole conversation, but thank
Yeah,
you.
it's a whole other topic. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, so the idea would be that this alien bacterial network um, formed its own hierarchical complex structure within our own bodies. I mean, I don't know. It's not something, you'd have to think that through very carefully about how that would work, and kind of the mechanisms by which that would work, and how that would how information from that network would be entering the brain. And I think it's a whole other problem once you go down that route, I think. Always the answer is I don't know. I certainly don't claim to know what it could be, where it is, whether it's kind of right here, right now, one quantum away, as Terence McKenna used to say, whether it is in some distant location in this universe. I think that's unlikely based upon its structure, or whether it is indeed, some other part, which I think most likely actually is that it seems to be part of, based upon its structure, this hyperdimensional, hypercomplex structure. It doesn't seem to be instantiated in our reality, is kind of the point I'm getting at. It seems to be instantiated in a part of a much larger structure. And we are a very thin lower dimensional slice of this larger structure, and it's gating access to that higher dimensional, a much larger and much more complex and older, vaster structure. I think that's probably more likely in some ways than it being somehow instantiated either in our bodies or elsewhere in this universe.
That's fascinating. Anybody have any questions here? Maybe one last question before Andrew start his day. Yeah. Go ahead and get close to the mic, and I'll turn it up for you.
How you doing, Andrew? My name is David. I'm just one of the people here participating today. Can they hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. You were speaking a little bit before about the potential moving forward for there to be, instead of using like chemicals or molecular approach to changing the fluid state of the mind, talking about using magnets, and I do find that very interesting because of the whole approach to how things actually work, with there being essentially a polarity, a binary polarity in how everything works, in positive and negative, whether it's shifting electrons or whatnot. So in the approach that you're discussing, are you saying that this would be possible as we are, or simply through genetic engineering?
Yes, so it would be genetic engineering. So currently, using even powerful you can manipulate brain activity using magnets.
To some degree, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to some degree, but certainly to be much more focused
and specific,
and specific to these neurons. So you have to insert these
genes,
magnetic field sensitive receptors, the genes, into these specific neurons in these deep layers of the brain. That's, again, as I said, it's been done with animals. You can insert receptors into the hippocampus specifically, but the technology is not not yet there to do that kind of thing in humans. It would take something of a pioneering, an intrepid scientific spirit to try that. But I can imagine in the coming decades that technology will be available, and I imagine it will be used for some therapeutic purposes probably before people start repurposing it for
other uses.
Switching, for other uses.
Right. Appreciate you answering that for me. Thanks, man.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. So Dr. Gallimore, we appreciate your contribution to science. You've inspired a whole generation of psychonauts in this work and other science teams, and we're going to do our best to explore it in these unusual contexts that we're in as safely as we can, and we'll report back on how we're doing. And a lot of gratitude for you, and thank you so much for gracing us with your awesome ideas. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, good luck
with
the infusion, and I'll speak to you again soon.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.